Welcome to Book Club. I'm really into fun facts. Julie has an endless array of pop culture knowledge. Overall, I would say I liked it.
Something about the way she writes is like really concrete and immediate. Who is this man? Why is he in this costume? Like, why did he drop a squid? Like, you teased some juicy deets about the creation of this book.
This is, again, what Victoria finds interesting, not what is actually most important about these people.
What stories are we going to tell ourselves about this year?
Welcome to the party.
Welcome, guys.
Welcome to Book Club
with Julia
and Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as a tool for personal and community growth.
This week, we are reading Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Katelyn Doughty. 2 warnings here. First of all, there will be spoilers because we do talk about the whole book. So if you're a person who doesn't want to know what's inside a book before they read it, you have been warned. Also, this is a book about a mortician. So there is discussion of death and dead bodies. So if that is not your cup of tea, or, you feel like that's going to be pretty triggering, then, maybe check back in next episode.
And if it's not necessarily a trauma, but just kind of something you find generally uncomfortable to talk about, I think we would challenge, maybe, as this book does, that maybe we sit with our discomfort and examine it of why we are uncomfortable with death and dying. So if you're feeling maybe just a little uncomfortable as you come into this episode on dying, that's cool. That's where we all start, so many of us, and that's what we'll be talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm so excited that we are finally discussing this book. I did not realize, I knew it was an important book to me, but I didn't realize how generally formative it was of my entire outlook on life and death until rereading it and just we should do that one on the podcast. I can't believe we haven't done that one yet. When I was rereading this week, there was entire sentences that I'm I forgot that was from this book. I thought that was just how my brain had decided we were going to think about things. And it just kind of stuck with me. I read this book originally. It was a gift. Julie and I have long debated whether it was she who gifted it to me or our friend Reedley. But Julie was there for the purchasing of the book.
I was involved in the decision.
Yes. And I devoured it the first time. I devoured it the second time on the reread. I don't think I've been always a very morbid person, but this book, coupled with a summer internship with a life insurance company, really got me thinking more about death and planning for a good death. And as much as we can plan, we don't know when we're going to die necessarily. So it made me reflect on that a lot. I think it's also my anxiety showing that I'm the type of person that's hi, Mom and Dad. I know you probably never want to think about me dying before you, but should I tragically die when I'm young, here's how I like my body to be taken care of. And my parents okay, cool, happy Thanksgiving, good to see you too. What was your experience reading this, Julia?
Yeah, we must have been having conversations related to your life insurance job that summer, because I remember looking at it and thinking, oh, Victoria would love this. And I don't remember why I thought that, but I remember that thought. So we must have been talking about it that summer, when I went to stay with you while you were doing that job. But yeah, I also was sort of selfishly thinking, as both of us do with book gifts that we give each other. I was I really want to read this book too. It sounds bizarre, and I never seen a book like this before. I want to read it. And I was absolutely delighted with how funny it was. It's a really enjoyable kind of comedy read. It feels like a kind of classic workplace comedy, like The Office or Parks and Rec or something, but it's a mortician, and I was absolutely delighted. I didn't love the ending because she gets a little preachy, and it's sort of her pitching her life's work, and she wants you to get involved, and it kind of takes you for a loop because you're in this, you've sort of completed a very nice story arc about her life's journey, and then she's now join me. And you're like, I don't know. I don't know yet. And the ending kind of feels a little rushed, so I wasn't crazy about that. But yeah, because I never really spent much time thinking about death growing up, and I, up until that point, had only known of 2 people that had died, and I wasn't particularly close to them. So it was like a totally new world for me. But I absolutely loved it.
Yeah. So a little bit about Katelyn. You get a lot of this in the book itself because it is memoir, but we'll just read a little bit from her website. Katelyn Doughty is a mortician, activist, and funeral industry rabble-rouser. In 2011, she founded the Death Acceptance Collective, the Order of the Good Death, which has spawned the Death Positive movement. Her educational web series, Ask a Mortician, has been viewed almost 150 million times on YouTube, and all 3 of her books, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, From Here to Eternity, and Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs, were New York Times bestsellers. She lives in LA where she owns a funeral home, Clarity Funerals. So Katelyn was born in Oahu, Hawaii, and she kind of always was, thinking about death. In the book, she describes a really tragic and formative moment when she had witnessed the death of a small child, and this kind of kept her wheels spinning at night. I also, some of the stories she shares, sounds like she carries a lot of the anxiety or a version of the anxieties that I have carried as well. So after high school, she went to the University of Chicago where she graduated in medieval history, and her thesis was titled In Our Image, The Suppression of Demonic Births in Late Medieval Witchcraft Theory. She describes it as a summer must-read for all the lovers of demon sex in the late medieval church. After she graduated, she moved to California, and that's kind of where the book picks up at the beginning. And she works as a crematory operator, funeral director, a body van transport driver, and she did return to school. She went to Cypress College for a second degree in mortuary science. She was unhappy with the state and offerings of the American funeral industry, so in 2015, she opened her first funeral home. Yeah, and so you can check out more about her stuff on her website and a lot of the stuff like Order of the Good Death that she's involved with. But yeah, that's kind of Katelyn in a nutshell.
Yeah, a lot of that covers the summary as well because this is a memoir. But the basic arc of the book is that she, as Victoria said, witnessed a young girl fall off like a ledge in the courtyard of a shopping mall when she was young, and it was like all she could think about for a long time. And so she sort of followed that obsession through college, where she studied medieval history, and then straight out of college got a job at a crematory, and then went to mortician school, which I didn't even know that was a thing. And it just, I just had a good chuckle when I was like, wait, you have to go to school for this? There's a school for the people who, oh man. She sort of interweaves her own experiences navigating her progression through the funeral industry, or as she sometimes calls the death industry. Interweaves it with her, because she, is also a historian. So she interweaves her research of like the history of America's relationship specifically to funeral practices and death, and then comparing it to other cultures around the globe and how they interact with death. And so, yeah, that's basically it. She sort of comes to this conclusion at the end that like Americans need to get reacquainted with death as like a concept, but like more viscerally, be more involved with end of life stuff.
This podcast is made possible by our fantastic book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. Starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive posts and messages, get early and discounted access to future events, and more. And if you want to take your support to the next level, you can join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community? A possible neurodiverse person looking for resources? Or an ally hoping to learn more from an actually autistic person?
Members of this tier get free access to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. Follow the link in our show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. That's buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. We'll see you there.
Yeah, so in general, I guess the big takeaway of like what we learned was this idea of how Americans are really disconnected from death and dying.
Mm-hmm.
And on one hand, that understanding the history of the funeral industry and the role of capitalism can really point to why that is, but it's also this collective public choice. Kind of the public is to blame for this disconnection as well, that we have collectively just put it away. We don't want to see it. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to hear about it when it comes to death and the way our bodies naturally decay. So yeah, it was really eye-opening on many levels for me. Not only like the ins and outs of like embalming a body.
Oh my gosh.
Like,
seared into my brain.
Yeah, the logistics of how bodies are cared for or disposed of. Like, I don't even know what the right words are sometimes.
Yeah.
In our societies and some of the real issues that she points out of like whether it's a extortion of people's money when they're in a grieving time, or the way that government gets in the way of people like mourning death, because then you have to take care of that debt or the assets of whoever passed, and like it can be messy, and just like the financial part of it on top of like the biological part, like what are our bodies doing and what are the stages of decay and decomposition. None of this had I ever thought about before or really considered.
Yeah, it's like it all felt very, very new, which I think was part of her point, right? That like our culture is so disconnected from any discussion about death that this was entirely new to me, her whole book. But it's the way that she writes it is like very surprisingly accessible. I think because of her use of humor and the way that she narrates her experiences dealing with dead bodies is so casual. Like she sort of reminds you like it's a job, you know, and she talks about it like a job, and she's got deadlines and difficult customers, and she's got stuff she doesn't really want to do and stuff she likes better, and she's learning things. And you know, when you get into the specifics of, you know, a person's daily life, it's less intimidating, and she sort of treats it with this kind of lighthearted but also kind of macabre kind of humor that you just have a blast while you're reading it. And I think through doing that, she really models like how she wants us to interact with this concept through like how she writes about it. And she sort of leads you into it very gently, because you think you're reading a sort of comedic book about the woes of a mortician, and then you're hit with some like hard-hitting philosophy, and you're like, whoa, I've never thought about that before, you know. And she kind of like, the way her style really is very disarming, and I think it's a very smart way to approach the book. I don't think it would have worked if it was like super serious, you know.
Yeah, there's some really funny moments in this book that I straight up like laughed out loud, which when I'm reading books, I feel like that's like, I'll laugh out loud at a movie way quicker and easier than I'll laugh out loud at something I'm reading. I'll like just smile at the page, but I like literally was like, ah! Just like scream laughing.
Yeah.
One of my favorite little bits is when she is in what she calls death school, when she goes back to college to get her degree in mortuary science. And she's writing about the first day when in their orientation, they had to like introduce themselves to everyone and explain like why they wanted to be working in the funeral industry. She writes, "I was hoping this sharing exercise would help ferret out my fellow death revolutionaries. Surely they would boldly refuse to give the same cheesy party line answer, 'I just really want to help people.' No such luck. Even the students with the crazy eyes, the ones you could just tell enjoyed the transgressive proximity to dead bodies, had to talk about their desire to help people. Finally, the sharing circle arrived at me. I imagined myself yelling, "A new dawn is upon us! Join me while you still can, fools!" Instead, I said something about having worked at a crematory and, seeing a, quote, good future in the death industry. And then it was over. Everyone grabbed their Nightmare Before Christmas messenger bags and left in a thoughtful mood. And just like her very specific details to describe to you what kind of people were in this room. Wonderful. Loved it.
10 out of 10. Oh my God. And it's a little self-deprecating too. Like, it's not like she's saying she's immune. She's not part of that group, She's
Right.
like, these are my people. I feel like a good function of humor is to point out the things that we don't want to talk about and giving you permission to laugh. This is something the comedian Daniel Sloss has he has a whole mission about getting people to laugh about death because he lost one of his sisters, and he feels like it's a really, really important part of grieving and dealing with death as a concept. And I feel like he's right. It definitely, you gotta laugh about death school, man. You gotta laugh about it. One of the things that is just seared into my brain is the way that she describes the embalming process, and she's sort of she's poking at it and is being like, this is the most ridiculous thing, because the amount of work that you have to do to not scare, if you're doing an open casket or something, to not scare people is just bizarre. You gotta drain the fluids and you use makeup, and because of bloating, a lot of times families will give you clothes that they want the person to be buried in, but they don't fit, and so you have to make it, you have to sew things and cut and dye the hair, and it just if you look at it up close, it doesn't even really look like a person anymore. It's not like Egyptian embalming, if that's your only knowledge of what embalming is like. It's more for what it looks like rather than for preservation. And I remember feeling why on earth do we do this? Because it feels so absurd. And years later, that's one of the main things I remember from this book, is that image of her just being what the heck? And when she saw it up close, had to do it herself. And she makes the connection to it's all about preventing people from being uncomfortable. They don't want the body to look dead. But sometimes here's the thing that really got me. Sometimes they do it even if there isn't an open casket, but people just want it done anyway, and then it prevents, they have to put a bunch of preservation chemicals in there, and it's it prevents the bodies from decaying after it's been buried, and it can be I don't know. I just remember being very frustrated by that too, because I was why would you do it if no one's even gonna look at it? We just don't like the idea of a loved one decaying, all organic material on Earth,
Well, yeah, and it's also not even just oh, we don't want them to decay, but it's become there's a lot of misinformation about dead bodies, and a lot of thoughts of oh, it's unclean, it's it's riddled with disease, I shouldn't be near a dead body. But that's not true. The body is in the process of, it's totally different bacteria in the body now, than the ones that are going to get you sick. She even has stats in the book about if a dead body is HIV positive, you would interact with them as you would any person with HIV. You're not going to catch it by breathing the same air. Or she has this terrible story of a daughter who calls and says, my mother passed away, and I don't know if it was a detective or police officer was you need to contact the crematory right now. And it was because her mother had diabetes. And
What?
she's you can't catch diabetes from a dead body. You can't even just catch it from another person. That's not how diabetes works. And there's so much misinformation around it. And so a lot of the default is to embalm. And she writes to how the crematory she worked for actually underbid this mortuary school in the Bay Area to handle the bodies of like basically people who are unclaimed, you know, like homeless people or people without families or people who like no one was taking care of, and it was like on the government to like take care of the bodies. But they were embalming every single body, like of someone who wasn't going to have a funeral, that wasn't claimed by any living person, and they would still like the government would pay for it to be embalmed by this school, and so they underbid to like cremate all these bodies instead of embalm them. So she's got a great video. It's more recent on her Ask a Mortician series, which it's kind of clickbaity in the title, but it is a really fun video where it's like, I get embalmed. And like, she doesn't technically get embalmed because like she's still alive. You can't embalm a living person. But she talks with like a friend who is professionally like can embalm bodies. And she like, I don't know if her thinking has changed since she wrote this book, or just she was like being straightforward in the video. She's like, a lot of people think I'm completely against embalming. She's like, I think there's a place for it. I just think Americans way overdo it. Like we spend way too much money and like effort embalming, and maybe not always for the best reasons. But they like gave a few reasons why you might want to, like perhaps a loved one passes or dies when they're across the world and you want to bring the body back. You need to embalm the body to transport it, and so that you can have like the funeral or the grieving process that you want to have with the body, but you couldn't because you weren't there in person. Or, I mean, they filmed this like after they were vaccinated, like with the pandemic, they were like, so many people died at a time where you couldn't have in-person funerals, but embalming the body allowed families to schedule a memorial or funeral service into the, you know, down the line if they wanted to do an open casket or burial situation, or just see the body before cremating. So I think in the book she's very like she gives the impression of like very anti-embalming.
Yeah.
But I think her more nuanced stance, at least today in the one video I watched of her, and even in parts of the book as well, of like we just overdo it. We don't. Not everybody needs embalmed. And why do we like think about why we want to embalm or think we have to embalm? I think she critiques the misinformation more than like someone making an informed decision about wanting to be embalmed or embalming the bodies someone they care about.
Yeah, I mean, she really picks apart because it's just such a default, you know, for like, isn't everyone embalmed and buried in a fancy casket that can't even decompose?
Yeah, like, it's like in a concrete box under the ground.
Yeah, like isn't that how everyone's buried? And it's like, no, around the world that's not really that's not how everyone does it, but that's how we do it. And then she kind of goes into the history of why as Americans we handle death that way. It started in the Civil War, right? Because that was like because so many people were dying far from home. So many people. And so they, in order to transport their bodies back home, they needed to, one guy figured out how to like preserve bodies for longer so that their families could bury them. Because before that, you died at home, your family prepared your body, then you were buried in like the family grave in the backyard.
Yeah, when she was talking about like death in the Civil War, it's one of those things that's like, you know, but then you get reminded of like the logistics of that. Like 26,000 people dying on a battlefield. That's 26,000 dead bodies just laying there. She talks about at one point the Union and Confederate soldiers like calling a timeout basically so they could clear the dead bodies. And I'm like, what? At that point, just
stop fighting.
Question mark. And I also found it fascinating how she kind of sees it from all perspectives. So like, you know, embalming started out of a practical need.
Right.
During the Civil War, but also served a need for what at the time were called undertakers. Previously, it was just someone needs to put together a box that we can put this body in and then dig a hole and bury it, you know? And it was like a labor job. It wasn't seen as something that you would need much education for. She cites some advertisements from the 19th century where it's like John Doe, undertaker, lumber, furniture maker, like just like a whole list of jobs.
Right.
Like undertaker is just like a side gig for when it was needed.
It was like, who's strong enough to dig a hole?
But by making embalming such like a practice and kind of selling it as like a needed thing. Like, this is sanitary. This is for the best, you know, do what your family member deserves. Like, give them what they would have wanted, you know, like the respectability in death, and like, because it's a way to sell their services. Because a lot of people can build boxes and dig holes, but not many people are trained in embalming a body in a way that makes it look somewhat like they're just asleep. Or, you know, like it looks like your family member and they're not actively, you know, turning weird colors as they decompose in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, the capitalism thread is pretty strong. It's like like early 20th century, there was this guy out in California who sort of revolutionized. He like completely changed the funeral industry by presenting this sort of glorious, restful. He like emphasized like the branding of the space of the cemetery, of where people would be laid to rest. Like, he wanted, you know, manicured lawns and trees, and then in the funeral practices of like having the nicest coffins, and having like, he really sold a beautiful but also like, this is the best thing for your family member. This is the right thing to do. This is the most respectful thing to do. But he was really selling like a completely hands-off death experience, where like you shouldn't even be able to tell that your family member has died. You shouldn't have to think about it at all. You should give it all to us. And he created these massive cemeteries in Southern California, one of which is Hollywood Forever. Or I don't know if he created it, but he like rebranded it, I think, and turned it into like a massive industry. And I've actually been to a concert at that cemetery.
It is weird going to the website for Hollywood Forever, and it's like funerals, burials, cremations, events.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cultural events. It's like, okay.
Yeah. It's really bizarre. It was a Keaton Henson concert, which makes a lot of sense. It's perfect, yes, in my opinion. Also a very morbid artist. And so you like park in the cemetery, and then you walk. There's no streetlights or anything in there, so it's like pitch black, and you sort of walk through a cemetery to go stand in line. There's like a Masonic lodge on that's not in use anymore, that's like on the property, and they do like small events and concerts and stuff. I mean, it was absolutely perfect. It was one of the best concerts I've ever been to. It was beautiful. He had like a 6-piece string, and then he had a piano, something along those lines. Anyway, but it was just like so sad. Everything about it. It was just like the most sad, dark atmosphere, and the most sad, dark music, with his little whisper voice that he uses when he tries to talk to the audience. It was amazing, but really bizarre location. And so when she talked about it in the book, I was like, hey, I've been there.
That's funny.
Really funny to me.
Yeah, so she writes about this guy, you know, in the 50s, and like what the funeral industry was in this time, and then it kind of tracks the history into the 60s, where Americans start feeling like, wait a second, why are funerals so expensive now? And like, or is this really in our best interest? Or are we getting like upcharged for like, you know, a better casket, a cooler headstone, you know, like kind of feeling taken advantage of, like when you're in your period of grief and mourning, to be like, well, wouldn't mom really love this like expensive add-on or whatever? And it's like, okay, that feels a little gross. And there was kind of like a pendulum reaction the other way in the 60s. Jessica Mitford is kind of like a big name in the funeral, death and dying space that Doughty both completely compliments and then also critiques. Kind of complimenting her in her reaction against this like very consumerist, capitalist funeral industry, and kind of advocating for more natural deaths as far as like how the body is taken care of afterwards. But Mitford's, how Doughty critiques Mitford is that Mitford's very much like, let's just remove people altogether. You know, like, remove the family from the situation. Like, don't make it a big thing. Like, simplify the process, which would be like, ship the body away. Someone else can handle it. And Doughty's like, can't we have both? You know, like, let's reconnect as individuals to death and dying. Let's not remove humans from it, but maybe let's remove this, like, pressure to spend a lot of money or to, you know, go above and beyond to put the body of a person you cared about, like, completely embalmed and preserved, and like we mentioned, like, a box that's not going to decay, and like in a vault made of concrete or marble. And it's like, yeah, kind of like the excess in many ways she critiques.
Yeah.
So I found that interesting too, like, kind of like essay writing 101. You know, you talk about both sides. You give, you know, supporting details and then present your own argument that's different than all of the above.
Yeah, the fact that, like, the way that they sold funeral services was about, like, glamour, like, in order to cover up the uncomfortable aspects of death. Instead, they were like, let's make this as glamorous as possible. And, you know, it obviously had a largely capitalist angle of like, oh, well, we can make more money this way. But it also, I think part of what traps people is that we don't have these kind of conversations with our families or on our own of like what we want, how we want to be buried. We don't have those kind of conversations. We don't have any understanding of what happens to dead bodies. We don't talk about that at all. We don't, like, you know, when my grandma died when I was like, I don't know, 8 or 9, I don't even remember if I saw the casket. I was like so removed from the whole process. It was like such a theoretical almost experience to me, where it was just like 12 people sitting on some folding chairs on some grass talking about someone. And the funeral industry benefits from us not knowing, because then we'll just go, okay, well, how much, I'll just spend all this money because that's what I'm supposed to do, I think. And I think it increases our fear of death as well when we're so distant from it. Like, I think part of why it's so important that she uses humor in this book is to kind of say, like, hey, look, it's not so scary. You know, like, there are some very scary elements to it because it's the end of a life, but also it's very much interconnected with life. You know what I mean? Like, this is part of being a human being. You can't just pretend it doesn't exist, which is what most of American culture does. We pretend it doesn't exist and we refuse to think about it. And I think that increases your fear of it when you aren't allowed to talk about it or you aren't allowed to think about it. Taboo makes you think about a thing more, but it just decreases the amount of information that's out there. Like, if you think about, like, periods, right? Periods, super taboo. You're not allowed to talk about them in public spaces. It increases people's fear of them and then also decreases the amount of information people have about it. That's what taboos do. So, yeah, I feel like it's in our own personal best interest to, like, be honest about it and ask questions.
One of the big takeaways for me reading this book again for the second time is understanding what laws are in place in the place that I live and where my family lives when it comes to handling bodies. Because from the examples in this book, even the people who are quote unquote in charge do not know the rules. You know, you might have someone at a hospital or someone who works for the police or the fire department say, like, you have to call, you have to report this right now. Like, someone has to come pick up the body and you may not be ready for that yet. And in many places, the family, they have rights to the body. Like, the body is theirs and it's not like the funeral home, like, owns the body. I know that's a weird word to say, but if you don't want the funeral home to have the body, in many places, depending on the rules and the laws, you can take the body back because it is your body. If you're, you know, depending on who has the rights, usually it's the family or spouse. And so it's made me really curious to, like, look into, like, what are the rules in Illinois? What are the rules where my family lives? And understand that, because a lot of times you hopefully have a lot of time to think about it. You know, like, someone is on hospice, or they've been ill for a while, or they're getting older, and you can like start to have those conversations. But unfortunately for many people, there are untimely deaths or unexpected deaths that come way sooner than you even had a chance to think about it. And in that moment, you don't want to be trying to figure out all the rules or like trying to figure out what you think. And there's one quote talking about like knowing what to do when someone dies. There's one section I really liked where she says, accepting death doesn't mean you won't be devastated when someone you love dies. It means you will be able to focus on your grief, unburdened by bigger existential questions like, why do people die? And why is this happening to me? Death isn't happening to you. Death is happening to all of us.
Mm.
And the more we can have the conversations about the logistics, about our philosophy, for many of our theology around death and dying, it can make when the time comes for us to experience the loss of a loved one, maybe not easier per se, but at least it's one less thing to keep on the table when you're trying to figure out a lot of other stuff. You can really just be present for your grief instead of, I don't know, existential crisis spiraling, which I'm sure many of us have felt when a loved one has passed.
I feel like this, this book was super formative in how I see everything, because I feel like I notice other cultures' treatments of death more than I might have previously. Like, I was watching this Netflix show, I think it was called Kiri Haji. It was like part Japanese, part English, like set in England, English show about like two brothers, and they sort of do like a makeshift traditional Japanese funeral ceremony where you burn a body and then remove the bones with chopsticks together. Like, you have one chopstick and another person has the other one, and you like pick up the bones together and put them in this little box. And when I watched it, I was like, oh, Katelyn Doughty talked about that. I remember her talking about this specific practice, and she goes into a wide variety of cultures. But like, I remember watching that and feeling like, oh, in the context of the show and their family, I can see how that's like super respectful. It's a super respectful way to handle your family members, to like be up close and personal, and to like personally put their bones in a box as sort of a way to say goodbye, and to treat it with a lot of respect rather than to push them far away and not have anything to do with it, and just say like, make them look as undead as possible, put them in a shiny box and put them in the ground. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to look at it. And yeah, I feel like I kind of see it everywhere now when I, watch things from other countries. And yeah, it's super fascinating. And it's sort of, after reading this book too, it made me like want to talk about it with my family. I remember I came home for Christmas break. I was like, hey, how do you want to be buried? And they were like, why? And then I was thinking about what I would want. It was kind of nice to think about, to like have that decision made. It was weirdly comforting.
Yeah, so my dad, working for churches like my entire life, he has attended more funerals than anyone I know. And his stance has always been, a funeral is for the living, not for the dead. And I really like that sentiment because it puts less pressure on like, well, what would mom want? It's like, well, what do we need in this moment? Which can be hard, especially when you have a lot of family members. If people want and need different things, it can be helpful for the deceased to have already stated their desires, because then you can be like, well, this is what we agreed on in advance. This is what we're going to do. But ultimately recognizing like the passing of a loved one, we have to handle it. The people who are still left, we have to handle it. That person's already gone. Whatever you believe about where they are now or what they're doing or if they exist at all, anything that happens is for us, and for us to just push it away like, ew, that's gross, I don't want to deal with it. It's just like exhibit A of denial, of not accepting what comes with life. With life there is death. So for me, I attended several open casket funerals growing up of people I knew distantly or didn't know at all, but because like my dad worked at a church and maybe my mom was out of town for the weekend and like I tagged along to a funeral or something. Like But both of my grandmothers have passed away in my young adult years, teenager young adult years, and living farther away that I couldn't be there when they were, as they were dying. My one grandmother died very suddenly from a stroke. So being able to see their bodies one last time was actually very meaningful to me. I think if I hadn't had that moment, it would have just affected my grieving differently. But my family tends to, pretty traditional for my family too, like if someone passes, it's like that week we do the funeral. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of people have different opinions about how you do that or what you do and what works for families. But another thing my dad's always been about is like, we're all grieving right now. Let's do it together versus like trying to pick a date in the future, what works for everyone. And sometimes you have to if your family lives really far away, if traveling on short notice is like not financially feasible for people. So all this to say, no judgment, but just like what my family does, maybe because I'm used to it, but I'm also like, that's kind of what I appreciate in the grieving process is like being able to immediately be with each other, to grieve together. Mm-hmm. And if it was the wishes of the deceased to have an open casket, or if they hadn't decided and the family wants to, I haven't found benefit in being a part of those experiences. Though personally, I don't think I want to be embalmed. I also like, this also brings up my existential dread about where am I from, what is home? Because I'm like, where would someone bury my body? My family lives all over the place. And like the one place where a lot of my extended family lives, I have never lived. I don't call it home. So it's like, I don't know. I did tell my parents at one point of like, if I pass before you, which I hope I don't, and if you want to bury me, choose a place that you want to, if it's important for you to have a place to visit, put me somewhere where you would want to visit me, not where you think I should be. But otherwise, please just cremate me or put me in like a natural burial ground where the body isn't treated. There's a easily decomposed box that the body's put in.
Yeah.
Make me into a tree. I don't know. All those seem really cool. Very circle of life, which I'm all about full circle stuff.
Yeah. I want to be a tree so bad. I'm like, that sounds amazing. Cremate me and bury me under a tree. I want to be fertilizer. Like, let me create some new life with my death, like that feels, that's like a very, weirdly, it's similar to like what we talked about with Omnivore's Dilemma of like the importance of having all the different aspects of the circle of life in one spot because they feed into each other. And like the feces and the bugs and the death and the decomposition, like it's all a very important part of healthy plants and healthy animals and healthy life, like I feel very strongly about that for human bodies. I want to fertilize a tree. Let's go. I want to feel like my body is serving a purpose, when I'm gone, doing what it's supposed to be doing. So yeah, I feel very strongly about that. One of my favorite, Science Mike, one of our favorite human beings on planet Earth and podcaster, he really wants to be shot into space so that he can
like on brand for him.
So that he can orbit the Earth. He wants to be shot into orbit and just like float.
Like his entire body or like his
whole body?
Ashes?
No, his whole body. He wants to be shot into space. And he really wants like people in like the International Space Station to just see like a man floating back.
Oh my gosh. That's
funny.
Oh
my god. Anyway, yeah, that one always cracks me up. Because I don't think you would decompose in space. Like you would be perfectly preserved. Anyway. Yeah, since reading this book, I've had a lot closer experiences with death because both of the living grandparents that I had like relationships with, they both died within like a year of each other, but they died like they were living with my parents. Like my parents were caring for them, which was not like they were not home. They died very, very far away from their home. They're from Pennsylvania and they died in California. And my, extended family on that side is scattered all over the country. And so we like all over the country. And so they set a date, I think it was like a week later, but it like gave enough time for everyone to come home, or to come out here. I like took 2 weeks off, and that one I had like a much closer, more intimate experience with it because I saw her. It was my grandma first. I saw her the day before she died, like in hospice and got to talk to her and hold her hand, and you could kind of tell she was on her way out. And so everyone who was there sort of took a chance to like say goodbye, you know, and it was a much more like, it was very visceral, but it felt like really closing a chapter, you know what I mean? Like I felt very connected to it. And then we had a funeral with like everyone in the family, and we all stayed in the house for a couple days and like ate together, and all the cousins were together for the first time in however many years. And, you know, it felt like a proper grieving process. And then my grandpa, her husband, died a year later during COVID. And so I felt so bad for my mom and her sisters because they had to plan a funeral during COVID, and it was like live streamed, and you know, there was very little you could do, and it was quite sudden, so no one got to say goodbye, and we were all very removed from each other. And it was the most bizarre experience. It was like in the middle of a workday. I logged on for 15 minutes to like watch a funeral, and they played taps for him. And it was, you know, it was a nice service, but it was very, very different experience. Like very, very literally removed from the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it felt a lot less real. And that sort of was a very visceral demonstration for me of like the value of being with the person who is dying if you can, or recently after they've died, and like being with family. And I you know, want to be much more up close and personal with it. I don't want to feel like I'm trying to avoid it, you know, because then you don't really get to process it. So yeah, all the people who lost family members during COVID, I talked to so many people who went to or watched funerals and had to wear masks, or like you couldn't go in person or whatever, and just really heartbreaking. That was a really dark way to wrap that up. Sorry.
It's an episode on death and dying. It's appropriate.
Yeah, and it just, you know, it would be remiss of me to talk about death without addressing the, like, what is it, like 4 million people who have died so far?
Yeah.
So, you know, we gotta confront it. And I feel like this ties into the episode on the stories of COVID that we did recently, where we were like, we're already seeing people try to forget and try to pretend that it didn't happen. And that's just very, very similar to it's like a more extreme extension of how our culture deals with death. And like, we're experiencing loss on a massive scale, and we need to, you know, take a good look at it.
There's a church near where my parents live in outside Cleveland, and they have in their yard, like whenever I've gone to visit my parents in the past year and a half, we drive past this church often, and they have all these hearts on little stakes in the grass that are representative of people who've passed from COVID. I don't know if it's individuals from like the church community, or if it's like one heart for every 100 people in the US or something like that. But it, like, every time we would go, they'd be like, or pass by this church, it'd be like more hearts in the lawn. And I just thought it was really important that like it was memorial in a way, but also like very present on like the side of a busy road of like, I know life feels insane right now, or maybe you're frustrated, or you're like done wearing masks, or mad at your neighbor if we're not getting their vaccine or whatever, but like, let's not forget there's been a lot of loss right now, and even if you don't know someone personally, it's not any less real. So bury us as trees.
Yep. You can put us next to each other. We can make a little forest.
Oh, so cute.
Yeah.
And then someday they can trim the branches of the tree and turn it into pulp to make paper, and then we'll make books, and there'll be book club with Julia books.
We can
made
become
from our ashes.
books, Victoria. Wait,
wonderful.
That's kind of a bizarre but cool business model for book lovers, is say, we will bury you in this specific forest that gets made into paper so you can become a book.
Well, I feel like it could work if it was like, you know, we knew where this number was going, because it's like either you become a book or you become toilet paper. Either way, you're contributing to society, and we're thankful for your body decomposing into the ground.
Right. That's true.
But I like the idea. I think we can work with it. So for people who read this book and want to learn more or, continue their philosophical thoughts on death and dying, what would you recommend they check out next?
The comedian I mentioned earlier, Daniel Sloss, he has a special on Netflix called Dark. I would highly recommend that one. And it's like a full hour of comedy on death as a natural part of life. Very therapeutic. And then, Victoria, you mentioned that Katelyn Doughty has a YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician, and I didn't realize that was her, but that channel.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I didn't know that was her, but that channel has been recommended to me a lot. I think I've watched maybe one of them. I don't know what that says about my YouTube algorithm, but that channel has been recommended to me a lot. And I think part of the reason is because I love watching. One of my favorite YouTube channels is the Institute of Human Anatomy. They have a YouTube channel, and it's pretty low budget, but it's just this one guy who works there who gets super excited about taking apart dead bodies and showing you things. And he's like, here's some anomalies we found, and some these are like the bodies of people who've dedicated their bodies to science, and they've been all the juices have been taken out of them, and so that they can be dissected by med school students and stuff and researched. And so he'll show you an enlarged heart, or a pacemaker, or there's a piece of a lung missing, or this ovary is 3 times the size, or here's what happens to your body when this thing is going on, and he shows you the actual body parts. I'm obsessed with it. It's an acquired taste, but it's weirdly adorable and charming, and it's a great way to learn. I was always the kid in high school where I loved doing dissections. Absolutely loved them. I was like, give me the baby pig. Except the bugs. I could not handle dissecting the bugs because I couldn't handle the crunch sound. It was very upsetting to me. But all the others, we did a ton of dissections. I think we even did a tiny shark. Anyway, and in biology class, we would have a group of us, and a lot of the girls wouldn't want to do it. And so they would all just come stand behind me while I dissected it, and the frogs or whatever. I was like, ooh, look, there's the frog spleen right there. And I would get in, and I had a blast with it. I couldn't tell you why I love it, but I do. So yeah, if you're like me, then I would recommend that channel.
My recommendations, a article that was also really formative for me was The Movement to Bring Death Closer by Maggie Jones. New York Times The Daily has, it was one of their Sunday episodes of the podcast where they have someone read an article. Katelyn Doughty does get name checked in this one, which is pretty cool. But they follow more closely the story and perspective of a woman who is a death doula, which it gets a brief mention in Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, but death doulas kind of walk alongside people who are dying and their families to kind of, in the same way a midwife helps bring a new life into the world, a death doula or death midwife kind of help people on their journey out of this world. Mm-hmm. And the article was also really part of the reason I started thinking more about what are the rules around who has possession of a body when they pass? Do you have to call a coroner right away when someone dies? How long do you have before you have to report that someone is dead? Really cool. The article also interviews a lot of people who are kind of death rights activists, if that's what they want to be called. I'm not quite sure. But people who advocate for more information about what are your rights as a family member for someone who's passed. If you want to read more fiction that kind of gets into the philosophy of death and dying, A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Oseki. We covered it on the podcast, but a lot of similar themes, and I think also has a really beautiful description of the ceremony for one of the main characters' grandmothers who passes. They do the similar, as you described, kind of Buddhist collection of the bones after a body's been cremated. Yeah, those are my recommendations.
Cool.
So what are things that are bringing you joy right now? What are you currently obsessed with? Believe on a joyful, positive note.
Yes. So I have gotten really into this podcast called Perfect Sounds. It's a BBC podcast by a comedian named James Acaster. You might know him as the meme where he's on the British baking show and he says, started making it, had a breakdown, bon appetit. That's him.
That's awesome.
He's one of my favorite comics. But anyway, basically the story of this podcast is that his life kind of fell apart in 2017. He had a bit of a breakdown. And so as a way of coping, he got obsessed with the music of 2016, the year before everything went wrong. And he's trying to buy every single album that was created or released in the year 2016. I'm talking every single one. He's racked up, I think he's in the mid 600s right now.
That's insane.
Yeah, it's wild. And I'm talking like every album. Like he goes on to Bandcamp and there's an album that's been bought 8 times and he'll like buy it anyway.
Oh
so
my gosh.
Basically on this podcast, he'll bring on one of his comedian friends to try and convince them that 2016 was the greatest year for music of all time. And they'll listen to one of these 700 albums that he's bought and talk about it for half an hour.
This is wonderful. And I think Spotify has recommended me this show. Because that seems right up my alley.
Yeah, he plays some really weird music, very experimental. He's got kind of eclectic taste and he tries to be as global as possible too. So you've got like Japanese folk fusion music and South Colombian music and like really runs the gamut. And so I've just been listening to this while I work and just been plowing through it. And I found a few artists that I actually like from it. Some of them I'm like, I would never listen to this, but this is fascinating. And some of them are really cool. And one of those that I started listening to a lot is Laura Mvula.
Oh yeah, you sent me her.
Yeah, I sent it to Victoria. She's a British artist. Really hard to describe her style, but I've really been enjoying her music as well.
Things I'm currently obsessed with. I think I might have mentioned in a recent episode, maybe I didn't, but Vern and I have been going to more comedy shows here in Chicago and having a blast. But we just saw Neil Nanda perform last night and he's fantastic. He said it in it's also fun going to like smaller clubs where you can like actually like chat with people afterwards. Mm-hmm. So Vern had a chance to chat with Neil and he's like, yeah, man, like let me know. And when you want to come to another show, if I'm in the city, like hit me up, I'll get you tickets. And we were like, oh my gosh, we're like in. Are we cool yet?
You're in the scene.
We're in the scene. Yeah, apparently he's filming a Netflix special soon. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. But yeah. That's cool. Kind of my life right now. Varun and I have started a Masala Mondays. We are on strong week 2.
Oh my God.
To start cooking more of the South Indian food that he grew up with and learn how to cook it ourselves. So his mom and dad very generously put together like giant like recipe collections for us. Wow. They just like photocopied a bunch of their stuff. So yeah, it's been fun.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Book Club with Julia and Victoria. Chime in with your own thoughts and recommendations on Instagram at Book Club with JV or through the contact form on our website, www.bookclubwithjv.com. Our website is also where you can find show notes for this episode, which include links to any of the recommendations we gave or other tidbits we mentioned. Make sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're currently listening, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple while you're there. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Febland, and Rebecca Gesney is our project manager. We'll catch you all on our next episode. Happy reading!